Welcome to part 2 of today's lecture on economic sanctions and arms embargoes. We've explored one major objection to economic sanctions, the liability objection. Let's now turn to a second. This is what we can call the intending the in harm objection. It claims that sanctions are a means used that intentionally harm innocent civilians. It's alleged by critics of sanctions that they are intentionally targeting civilians so that they will, in particular, enact suffering of the population that will persuade the target state to change its policy. The target population will then revolt, changing the government's policy, or the target government will simply not want their citizens to bear any costs anymore. In October 2011, the US Republican Senator Mark Kerr, who was influential in the US sanctions policy on Iran, said that it was okay to take the food out of the mouths of the civilians from a government that's plotting an attack directly on American soil. And that its ambition, the sanctions regime ambition, was that Iran's currency should become like that of North Korea. Similarly, US Democrat Brad Sherman, a keen supporter of sanctions in Congress, wrote that the goal is to drive Iran's economy into a crisis that forces leaders to the negotiating table, stating that critics argued that these measures will hurt the Iranian people. Quite frankly, we need them to do just that. So, the objection is that sanctions use the suffering of innocents to achieve policy change, and in doing so, they intend to harm innocent civilians. Why does it matter if the harm is intended? Well, it might seem to contravene the central premise of the doctrine of double effect. Recall that this says, as we looked at last week, that it's okay to use proportionate harm when it's unintended, but not when it's intended. So the issue is that the harm is intentional. How persuasive is this intending the harm objection? It seems that most sanctions regimes don't rely on the suffering of innocents in the target state to push the government to change its policies. As we've seen, some sanctions involve bans on goods, such as oil, and sanctions on assets, financial sanctions on assets or particular individuals, groups, banks, and so on. In doing so, they harm innocents as a side effect. They don't intend to harm. However, other sanctions regimes potentially do, as we've already looked at in the case of the Iranian sanctions. You might also wonder whether it really matters more fundamentally whether sanctions intend harm. In other words, you might be skeptical about the claim from the doctrine of double effect that intentional harms matter. To help with this, consider the following two cases. In case 1, Angola 1, Angola has been sending its troops into the civil war in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC. This is a hypothetical case, I should highlight, in order to gain favorable access to natural resources. The US imposes sanctions on Angola, knowing that the harm inflicted will cause a certain amount of suffering of innocent Angolans. But it also knows that the pressure of this suffering will, by internal uprisings, lead to the Angolan government ceasing its interference in the DRC, which is the central objective of the US. Overall, much more good will be achieved than harm. Now compare this with Angola 2. Again, the US imposes sanctions on Angola, knowing that the harm inflicted will cause a certain amount of suffering on the innocent Angolans. This time it knows that the embarrassment of being sanctioned will mean that the Angolan government ceases its interference in the DRC, again the main reason for the action of the US. The policy will be effective and lead to the same amount of suffering as in Angola 1. What do you think about these two cases and differences between them? It might seem that Angola 2 is permissible because the harm is not intentional, whereas in Angola 1, the harm is impermissible because the harm is intentional. On the other hand, you might think that that's odd. Why should we hold that these two very similar cases, it matters so much that the harm is intentional? It helps here to draw a distinction between intentions and motives. Agents' intentions are their objectives or purposes of their more immediate action, whereas their motives are their underlying reasons for action or their ultimate goal. Generally, we tend to think that it's agents' motives and not their intentions that seem to matter non-instrumentally. Let me try and give you guys a better handle on this. So suppose that you are hard up and now starving. You spent all your student grant on essentials, but still run out of cash. And the University Hardship Fund won't give you any more money. Your best friend is much richer than you, gets money from their parents every month, loads of money. You're both going to Tesco's on Oxford Road. Suppose that this is a few months afterwards, that the pandemic is much more settled down. You both steal a loaf of bread by secretly not scanning it through one of these self-scanning machines. You have the same intention to steal the bread, but your motives differ. You simply want to feed yourself. But your best friend, she just wants the thrill of trying to steal a loaf of bread past one of these self-service machines. One of these very annoying self-service machines. Now, it seems that we would generally judge your act as permissible, providing there's no other reasonable way that you could feed yourself. You have a right motive to feed yourself, even if a wrongful intention to steal. But it's the motive that matters here. Your friend has a bad motive, the thrill of stealing, and a bad intention to steal. In criminal law, you'll often find that when people are punished, they're punished on the basis of their intentions, but if their motives are good, they will receive a far less severe sentence. So for instance, if they break the law in order to assist their family who are in a severely impoverished state, they will receive a far less severe sanction than those who break the law for other self-interested reasons. Similarly, in the case of sanctions, it seems that states should predominantly be motivated by concern to reduce the suffering of innocent, such as in the cases of humanitarian crisis. If they have such motives, you might not think that it matters if their intentions are seemingly problematic. For instance, in Angola 1, the motive is a good one, to help those in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And the central intention is designed to achieve this motive, a sanctions regime to help those in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So the point here is that we can look to the distinction between intentions and motives. It's the motives that seem to matter more, and this might suggest that intending the harm isn't so problematic as long as the motives are a good one. So this is a further response to the intending the harm objection. Let's now turn to a third objection. This is related to the intending the harm objection. It's what we can call the instrumentalization objection. This says that sanctions are wrongful, problematic, because they involve the instrumental use of the suffering of innocents to achieve the greater good. For instance, Joy Gordon argues that sanctions reduce individuals to nothing more than the means to an end by using the suffering of innocence as a means to persuasion, thereby violating the Kantian principle that human beings are ends in themselves. So the claim here is this: sanctions, such as on Russia, Iran, Cuba, Syria, by using the suffering of the general population to get the governments to change their policies, use the people as a means. Why does it matter, though, if people are used as a means? Well, several political philosophers, including most famously Immanuel Kant and John Rawls, pictured on the slides here, have argued that it's not acceptable to use people as a mere means. You have to respect them as individuals rather than viewing them as a tool. Using their suffering to try to enact policy change can mean that they are likely to, that they're like instruments simply to achieve our ends. We don't properly respect the fact that they are separate persons who deserve our respect. Separate persons who deserve our respect. Now, it's important to note that this is different to the intending the harm objection in the following ways. The objection is that the sanctions agent, the intending the harm objection claims that it's wrong because the sanction agent intends to harm the sanctions party. Now, the instrumentalization objection applies even when the sanction agent doesn't intend the harm. That is, it matters that the sanction party uses them as a means to an end, even if they aren't intending to harm them. Let's look at 3 responses to this objection to economic sanctions. Firstly, there's an obvious limitation. As for the intending the harm objection, it's going to apply at most to only certain types of sanctions regimes. It's going to apply only where the suffering of innocence in the target state is used to try to enact policy change. This might be the case, as we've seen earlier with the Pompei clip, with the US sanctions regime on Iran. In other sanctions regimes, in particular lots of the targeted and smart sanctions regime, it seems less plausible that the sanctions regime are trying to enact suffering as a means to try to change the policy of governments. Second query is this. It also seems that it's going to apply this instrumentalization objection to war and doing nothing. And in fact, a lot of the measures that we're going to look at in this course. Suppose, for instance, that the UK doesn't do anything in response to, say, mass atrocities, hypothetical mass atrocities in South Sudan. But it knows that doing nothing will lead to an uprising in South Sudan by citizens and rebels as they face mass atrocities. There would be a subsequent shift by the government of South Sudan. The point then is that here, in this case, doing nothing, and we could also apply some of the reasoning to other measures, would still lead to using people as a means. These options might involve the unintentional but foreseeable use of harms as a means to enact policy change. Third query is more fundamental. It's a stronger reply still. It says that it's not actually wrong to use someone as a means in the case of economic sanctions. This is as long as you're attempting to achieve a greater good and are actually trying to assist people. Suppose, for instance, that you want to eradicate global poverty. So you go around to your rich friends and family, tell them about how bad global poverty is. They say they've already done their fair share, they've already given their significant amount to tackle to international charities. But you don't quit. You go into the house every night, give them a 2-hour lecture on it. You do this repeatedly, several weeks, every morning, 4 a.m., when you like to have the biggest effect. You call them consistently about it. You don't let it drop. They can't sleep, can't concentrate, fail their exams, struggle to live their normal lives. But their suffering finally provokes a reaction. They give in and start giving away significantly more money to tackle global poverty, which foreseeably helps the lives of thousands. So say you've got lots of rich friends that you do this to. Do you think what you've done is wrong? Well, in this case, you are using the suffering of your friends as a means of helping to make an impact on global poverty. It's not that you want to bother your friends and family. It's just that this is the best way that you can do so. You're not showing them disrespect. You are using them instrumentally as a means, but it's not clear you're using them as a mere means. What this example highlights is that there's a difference between using someone as a means and using someone as a mere means. You realize that your friends and family will be suffering somewhat from your actions, and you don't really want to do it. You regret doing it. You simply figure out that you can reduce much more the suffering of people in other countries by lecturing consistently, nagging at, badgering your friends and family. Apply this to economic sanctions. In the case of sanctions, there might simply be no other way that the sanctioning state can get the government to change its policy. The thought is this: it has to impose suffering upon the population in order to achieve a greater good. The sanctioning state may lament the fact that there is no way of imposing costs of the sanctions on the innocent party in order to help others. This is the only way that it can get the government to change its policy. It might take seriously the harms that it enacts on the population in doing so, try to even ameliorate these harms, in which case it would not necessarily be using its citizens, using the citizens of those affected as a mere means. It would instead be using them as simply a means. If you go back to Kant, go back to rules, look at them closely, what they're concerned with in particular is when individuals are used as a mere means. Not simply as a means, but as a mere means when their interests, when their agency, when their value as a person is not reflected at all in any considerations. It's just discounted. They're less concerned when difficult decisions have to be made, when trade-offs have to be made. So far, we've looked at 3 objections. All of them are deontological. Deontological. Another way of putting this is that they are all intrinsic objections. What this means to say is that sanctions are sometimes wrong, not simply because of their consequences, but because of features of themselves. Inherently wrong, if you like, intrinsically wrong. We've seen that they're alleged to be wrong because they harm the innocent, they intend the harm, or they use people as a mere means. The 4th objection is more straightforward. It is simply about the consequences. It says that sanctions don't bring about good consequences, but simply sanctions don't work. It's claimed that they don't result in policy change in the target state. The case of the sanctions regime on Iraq was a huge failure. It didn't remove Saddam, didn't end his brutality, didn't preclude the war in 2003. Likewise, the sanctions regimes on Syria and Sudan have failed to stop government-sponsored abuses. Sanctions on Russia and Crimea, after Crimea, resulted, the argument goes, only on the counter-sanctions by Russia against the EU and cost individual citizens rather than the return of Crimea to Ukraine. US reintroduction of sanctions over the past couple of years under the Trump administration hasn't done anything to dampen down Iranian nuclear ambitions. In fact, it's only strengthened the hardliners, led to much more hostile relations between the US and Iran, and has imposed, as we've seen, severe harms on the Iranian population in doing so. So the objection then is that sanctions very rarely, if ever, achieve what they set out to do. This is what we can call the ineffectiveness objection. Sanctions don't work. Why might sanctions not work? Well, sanctions have often been criticized for adopting what Johann Galtung famously calls the naive theory of sanctions. Just to be clear, he's not proposing a naive theory himself, he's criticizing others for adopting this naive view. On the naive view, the more pain experienced by the target, the greater positive impact for the policy. So if you inflict more suffering and destruction with the sanctions, there will be a greater change in policy. This naive view, Galtung argues, overlooks a series of complicating unintended consequences. The most notable of these unintended consequences is what's called the rally round the flag effect. This occurs more generally, well documented in the political science literature, when a government gets behind their population, gets behind the government, sorry, when the population gets behind the government when it's seemingly under attack or in crisis. Here, the thought is this: even those in the receiver states and those under the sanctions regime who have serious reservations about the government or its agenda, nevertheless rally behind it when it appears assaulted from abroad. So they rally around the flag, get behind the government when there's a sanctions regime. In addition, sanctions are viewed as ineffective by many because those subjects to sanctions can adapt and evade them. They can use black markets, they can use grey markets. They might be able to get their goods or services from other countries. They might be able to sell their assets, sell the items that are under sanctions from other countries as well. Now, on its own, the claim that sanctions are not effective would not necessarily preclude the case for their use. If they could be used without harming innocence or precluding other means of tackling mass atrocities, it might be worth trying them. But of course, the problem with economic sanctions is that they inflict significant harm whilst being, as the objection goes, ineffective. Firstly, as the liability objection makes clear, economic sanctions harm innocent civilians. Second, a potential worry of sanctions is that they are used to give the impression of doing something to tackle the crisis and therefore avoiding undertaking more robust action. So the claim more specifically is this: economic sanctions are highly likely to be disproportionate because they, on the one hand, fail to achieve much good. They don't achieve their objectives. This is because of the rally round the flag effect, the fact that sanctions, those subjects to sanctions can evade them, can adapt. And on the other, they harm either directly with the sanctions regime, both the sender or the receiver of sanctions, as we've seen with the liability objection, or they do so indirectly by precluding more robust action to tackle the situation. So this ineffectiveness objection, just to repeat, says that sanctions don't work. More particularly, they are problematic because they're disproportionate. They're not effective on the one hand, they don't achieve much benefit, and on the other hand, they achieve significant harm, either to the target state population through the liability objection or because they foreclose, they block other potential options. Let's look at some responses. So, is this objection right? It does seem that sanctions may often not succeed, at least in securing their stated objections. But the ineffectiveness objection is not sufficiently strong to preclude the permissibility of economic sanctions. Completely, at least. First and most obvious, the harms of properly targeted sanctions are often far less grave and often sometimes limited to only those strongly suspected of being culpable for mass atrocities. This is in particular when they are targeted particular individuals. So the objection, you might think, has far less force when the sanctions are properly targeted. Secondly, defenders of economic sanctions argue that it's important to include in the assessment of effectiveness and whether there is a benefit achieved by sanctions, their longer term expressivist or symbolic effects. What does this mean? Well, the argument is that sanctions can help to make it clear that certain behavior is condemned. It can show clear disapproval for the behavior of the aggressor. For instance, launching sanctions on Crimea, it's argued, can make it clear that to Russia that the EU does not think that it's acceptable to annex part of the territory. And this, the argument goes, would help to check further Russian aggression, for instance, in Eastern Europe. If it hadn't have committed to the sanctions regime, it might have appeared to condone the Russian behavior. Why does it matter to express your condemnation? Well, as we're going to look at next week when we turn to diplomatic sanctions, such condemnation can be important for reaffirming international norms in the international system. And these norms, it's argued, can help to save lives in the longer term. So, for instance, making it clear that the EU condemned the annexation of Crimea might not help to win back Crimea, but can make it less likely in the future that another state will be annexed or subject to significant instability. This isn't simply because it knows that it might face sanctions, that is Russia, but also because it realizes that this isn't tolerated behavior. As I've said, we're going to look at these arguments in more detail next week. But the important point for this week is that sanctions might be justified by their longer term impact by clearly expressing outrage. Third, some recent findings on economic sanctions claim that they are, in fact, more successful. What they say is that although sanctions don't fully achieve their aims, they can sometimes help to constrain states and tackle conflict. And in particular, the book by the UN on UN economic sanctions by the Targeted Sanctions Consortium by Bierstecker et al. That's on the reading list this week explores this point. So, we've seen that there are several intrinsic objections to economic sanctions and one notable instrumental argument against them, the ineffectiveness objection. On the other hand, we've seen that defenders of economic sanctions present several replies to these objections. This ends part 2 of today's lecture.